Welcome to Down to Earth but Heavenly Minded podcast. Hosted by Irving Risch. Light from the land of the Sphinx. Chapter 12, the third three plagues of Egypt. Thunder, locusts, darkness. The majesty of the forces of the air and wind, the terror of thunder, fire, and hail, are connected in Scripture with divine supremacy in judgment. The Psalms frequently refer to this, and in the book of Revelation, thunderings and lightnings, Revelation chapter 8 verse 5, and a great hail out of heaven, Revelation chapter 16 verse 21, are expressions of divine wrath upon an idolatrous generation, upon man apostate from God, and under the headship of Satan. In this third group of Jehovah's signs and judgments, the priestly class, as such, is no longer in view. Our eyes are fixed upon the courtiers and the king. Pharaoh's immense palace was an entire city. The royal residence itself had on its face projecting balconies, from which, as from a tribune, Pharaoh could watch the evolutions of his guard, the stately approach of foreign envoys, and Egyptian nobles seeking an audience. They advanced from the far end of the court, stopped before the balcony, and, after prostrating themselves, stood up, bowed their heads, wrung and twisted their hands, now quickly, now slowly, in a rhythmical measure, and rendered worship to their master. Officials, counselors, friends and physicians unnumbered, waited upon his majesty, and every one flattered him. Even to have occupied the menial position of a laundress to him was an honor so esteemed as to be inscribed upon the tomb and to be handed down to posterity. His Holiness, see note 1, was the great priest of the land, through whom all its gods heard the prayers of the inhabitants. See note 2, the priests, in their offices, ministering in Pharaoh's stead. He had access to the deities at all times, he could see them, face to face, see note 3, when he would, indeed, he was, of the same race, and of the same flesh with the gods. See note 4. He was the God incarnate. He was actually divine, and at times would figure in a local triad as one of its divinities. In his own kingdom and by complementary potentates he was addressed as a god, see note 5, he even offered incense to himself. See note 6. There was deep meaning in Pharaoh's enormous statues towering up in city and plain above temples and obelisks, and looking down on ordinary mortals. Pharaoh's immense eyes gazed upon all Egypt, and could be seen from afar watching all. His huge mouth commanded all, as he sat in his undisturbed repose, the mightiest, the most terrible, the supreme, none like him in all the earth. Note 1. His Holiness was a common title, His Holiness, Thutmose III. Let the bravest of his warriors go before. The Life of the Captain Amenemhat, translated by Ebers. In the first year of King Seti they came to report to His Holiness, inscription celebrating a victory. See, A History of Egypt under the Pharaohs, Bruch, Volume 1, page 355, Volume 2, page 13. Note 2, The Dawn of Civilization, Maspero, page 266. Note 3, Ibid, page 1 and 25. Note 4, The Egypt of the Past, Erasmus Wilson, page 54. Note 5, The Tel Amarna Tablets, Conda, page 14. Note 6, In a variety of ways the pharaohs laid claim to divinity. On a wall picture at Assamble enemies fall, beneath the sword of Ramazu, the god. A History of Egypt under the Pharaohs, Bruch, Volume 2, page 92. In Abydos, Seti I is seen upon the huge wall, adoring his ancestors, and offering incense to their names, and as he had included amongst them that of his own, he offers incense to himself. See also 10 Years Digging in Egypt, pages 75 and 82, and A History of Egypt, W. M. Flinders Petrie, pages 53 and 181. Illustration, the kings frequently figure seated amongst the gods. The triad represented is given by E. Priest Evans in his Monuments Egyptians. The monument was found in Lower Egypt, and within the area covered by the Bible story. Perhaps we might explain the sentiment which produced the monument, as the god Ramesses, the son of the sun, seated between the sun gods, Tum, or Atumi, and Ra. Man in his majesty is ever proud, but never was there pride among men more powerful than in the pharaohs. It is not easy in our days even to conceive what an Egyptian monarch was. The kings and emperors of our times are insignificant in comparison with him. Whom art thou like in thy greatness? Ezekiel chapter 31 verse 2, said the Almighty of a Pharaoh far less mighty than he of the Exodus. Such kings were denied improvement and high moral aspiration by the misfortune of their majesty. They were their own standards of excellence, self-gratification and their own glory ruled their lives. What they willed they did. Whether the work was good or bad. There were elements of a most contemptible kind in the pride of the pharaohs. They would demolish whole cities in order to erase the names of their predecessors, and would appropriate the monuments of former builders to themselves, by chiseling out the names and inserting their own instead. Even the names of gods, of whose priests the king was jealous, would be cut out of monuments, and those of other deities placed in the honored position. Neither Egypt's religion nor Egypt's history can be read aright unless the pride of its kings be considered. The greater the pharaoh, the greater his greed for the glory of his own name. Ramesses II chiseled out of the walls of temples the very name of his father, in order that he might place his own there in its stead. A History of Egypt under the Pharaohs, Bruch, Volume 2, page 44. Speaking of some statues of Usertesen, in his History of Egypt, page 158, Professor W. M. Flinders Petrie says, all of these were barbarously ruined by Merenptah, who batted his name in upon the exquisitely finished surfaces. See also pages 92 and 170. And not only did these kings place their names on monuments which they never built, but they also destroyed cities and monuments erected by their ancestors in order that their own vulgar pride might be gratified. See 10 Years Digging in Egypt, W. M. Flinders Petrie, pages 110, 111, 128, and 129. To fill up the measure of hatred against the caste of the priests of Amun, the king, Amenhotep IV, issued a command to obliterate the names of Anion, and of his wife Mut, from the monuments of his royal ancestors. Hammer and chisel were put in active requisition on the engraved stones. The court was like the king. The chief nobles were pharaohs in miniature. Their servants cringed before them, and crawled at their feet. These nobles dwelt in their sublime loftiness, as much like deities on a small scale as was possible, and they, too, were prayed to after death. By means of the heavily paid priests, they appeared in the world to come in courtier state before the gods, and were waited upon by a host of slaves, at least, pictorially upon the walls of their tombs. Such was the court, and such was the king before whom Moses stood. Plague 7. A third time the word of Jehovah came to Moses, Rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh, and this was the message, Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, Let my people go, that they may serve me, for I will at this time send all my plagues upon thine heart, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, that thou mayest know that there is none like me in all the earth. Exodus chapter 9 verses 13 to 14. A remonstrance followed, for the words should read to the effect, that though God had stretched out his hand, Pharaoh was not yet cut off, but was preserved, so that he might, either by humbling himself, or by rejecting the divine warning, be the means of magnifying God's name. As yet exaltest thou thyself, like a dam to resist the waters, behold, tomorrow about this time I will cause it to rain a very grievous hail, such as hath not been in Egypt since the foundation thereof even until now. Exodus chapter 9 verse 18. We know not Pharaoh's reply, but the words recorded indicate there was a conversation between Moses and the king. Some of the court believed, and availed themselves of the advice to house their cattle and their servants, others despised the counsel, and lost all. At its appointed time the storm burst. Fire and hail fell upon the ground, trees and herbage, man and beast exposed to its violence, were destroyed. Only in Goshen, the land of flowers, nature smiled. There, though the sound of the storm was heard, no wrath from heaven fell. The wall of partition separating Israel from Egypt rose right up to the sky. Pharaoh attributed the unwanted thunderings to the very voices of God margin. He quailed, and sought the intercession of Moses. He owned he had sinned, an astounding descent from his throne of pride, and Moses promised deliverance, but added, As for thee, and we may well suppose him looking round upon the court, and thy servants, I know that ye will not yet fear Jehovah Elohim, Exodus 9:30, the sole and only and everlasting one, the maker of all. To such lengths did he go in the power of his God, that he would not even intercede within the walls of the idolatrous city, but lifted up his hands when outside of it, and at once the storm ceased. Then, true to the prophecy, Pharaoh and his court hardened their hearts. The flax and barley crops being specially named, we can fix the date of this visitation. It was late in the month of January or early in February. The end was near, there were but 4 weeks more, and Israel would be free. The barley was in ear, the flax in blossom. Flax is in flower at the end of January. Flax and barley are usually ripe in the end of February or beginning of March, wheat and spelled in April. C. Plague 8. The land began to grow green again. Fruitful soil, life-giving water, and constant sunshine do wonders. Once more Egypt smiled and blossomed. Then Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh, and delivered their message. The tone was severe. It is impossible to imagine them twisting their hands and prostrating themselves before the king. Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, How long wilt thou refuse to humble thyself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me, and then the alternative, locusts. And without waiting for reply, Moses turned himself, and went out from Pharaoh. Exodus chapter 10 verses 3 to 6. In modern times, enormous flights of locusts have been known, covering an area of over 1,000 miles, and which, when driven into the sea, formed a bank of bodies upon the shore some 4 feet high and 50 miles long. In India, a railway train was actually stopped by a piled-up host of these insects, as by running into a snowdrift. But the locusts threatened were such as never had been before, and such as never again shall be. The consideration was terrible to the court. For the first time the flatterers around Pharaoh spoke out, the custom of the palace was set aside, a fear greater than that of the king impelled them. Let the men go, said they. Knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? Exodus chapter 10 verse 7. The ruffled king in the end sent for Moses and Aaron, an angry controversy ensued, and they were cast out of Pharaoh's presence. But the 24 hours of grace were running out. Part of the time had been spent over the unwanted scene in that dignified assemblage. Royalty and nobles were learning in a personal way the discomfiture the magicians had already proved. Not any longer was the calm of a god upon Pharaoh's countenance. Probably the court was too full of vexation to hear the ominous sound of the rising east wind, for Moses had already uplifted the rod at God's bidding, the wind had arisen. And all the remaining hours of the day it blew, and continued all the night. Already Jehovah's army of the skies, that had been lying at 24 hours' distance, was on the wing. Obeying the call of the wind, the huge host arose, and, borne upon its gusts, the myriads sped on towards the land of Egypt. In the early morning, true to its time, or along the eastern horizon, a yellow fringe could be seen, rapidly expanding over the heavens, till, like a dense brown cloud, it covered the blue sky and obscured the light. The rush of the wings of the moving myriads was presently heard, and then in another moment the land was covered with devouring hosts, and filled with the noise of their resistless jaws. Every succulent thing fell before them. All that the hail had left was taken away. So far as the eye could reach, the land of Egypt was a wilderness, as barren as the yellow deserts upon its borders. Goshen, the garden of Egypt, also fell under the plague, for its fruits and its crops were no longer necessary for Israel. Pharaoh trembled once more, he called in haste for Moses and Aaron. I have sinned, he said, against Jehovah your God, and against you. Now, therefore, forgive, I pray thee, my sin only this once, and entreat Jehovah your God, that he may take away from me this death only. Exodus chapter 10 verses 16 to 17. And Jehovah was entreated. And Jehovah turned a mighty strong west wind, which took away the locusts and cast them into the Red Sea. There remained not one locust in all the coasts of Egypt. Exodus chapter 10 verse 19. In the last 2 plagues the air and the wind were used to work the divine will. The locust obeys the wind. Egypt's deities of air and wind were set aside, as had been the deities of earth and water. The plague of the locusts, together with that of the hail, destroyed the sacred trees of the land. These were especially besought in the time of harvest, and to the sycamore, all ranks gave homage, and tribute of the fruits of the earth. Plague 9. The heavenly bodies, so widely worshipped in Egypt, had hitherto not been dealt with by the plagues sent upon the land. The 9th plague, the completion of the number so important in connection with the deities, was to obliterate the host of heaven from the sight of their worshippers, and to put a stop to the chief religious ceremonies of the country. The temples were orientated to the sun, the moon, or to a special star, and the deities were connected with different heavenly bodies. The highest point of the religious ceremony in honor of the celestial deity, or personified orb, occurred at the moment when the particular heavenly body to which the temple was orientated cast its first bright beam between the double rows of sphinxes and obelisks, through the great gateways and the inner entrances and the doors, and right into the narrowed recess at the extreme end of the building, where, in the sanctuary, the image of the emblem of the god was placed. At that moment, which occurred but on rare occasions during the year, the image shone brilliantly for some 2 minutes in the sun or star beam. All around was in deep shadow, and the incident of the shining of the image was called the manifestation of the god. This was the supreme moment. Forth streamed the procession in honor of the deity, crowds of priests with the varied vestments and officers poured forth, incense bearers, banner carriers, uplifters of sacred emblems, supporters of shrines, musicians and singers, a throng of thousands. All combining to create a show of unrivaled religious pomp. The straight line with an arrowhead, on the diagram on the previous page, running right through the double row of sphinxes, through gateways, pairs of obelisks, and courts, and then through the pillars and the chambers in the body of the building, indicates how the beam of light penetrated into the inner sanctuary of the edifice. In sun worship various deities were represented, for example, at the time of the plagues, in its rising the sun was called Horus, on the horizon, in its light and heat, giving life and animation to the universe. It was called Ra, in its setting, it was called Tum. I am Khopri in the morning, Ra at noon, Tumu in the evening, was the declaration of the god of his titles, according to the legend. Thus said Ra, when he was smitten by the serpent through the magic of Isis. The system of the Egyptian religion did not permit of any deity retaining its precise character through many human generations. There was a continuous evolutionary process at work, adding to and modifying, and changing the nature of the deity. Tum originally had no representation. That first known of him is merely the general idea of a god without an emblem, and this fact indicates clearly that the hidden god had at one time a sound and definite signification. The hidden god without a representation, being the most ancient of the Egyptian deities, points to days anterior to idolatry, but as hundreds of years elapsed, and the time of the Exodus approached, the hidden god had assumed a variety of forms in many temples. The sun in its varied characters was the mysterious and incomprehensible being to whom Egypt paid highest religious honor. A festive hymn addressed to the sun god Tum will interest the reader, and will perhaps give a better insight into the spirit of the religion than a history of doctrinal development. Hail, thou who art come as Tum, and who hast been the creator of the gods. Hail, thou who art come as soul, of the holy souls of Amenti. Hail, supreme among the gods, who by thy beauties dost illumine the kingdom of the dead. Hail, greatest of all the gods, bearing rule in the highest, reigning in the nethermost heaven. Hail, thou who dost penetrate within the nethermost heaven, and hast command of all the gates. Hail, among the gods, whereof words in the kingdom of the dead. The worship of Ra was more nearly universal than that of any other Egyptian deity, unless it were Osiris, who was also a sun god. Tum is the sun, as he approaches or rests upon the western horizon, just before and when he sets. His common epithet is refer, good, and this is regarded by some as part of his name, which is expressed by Temu, Atum, or Nefertum. History of Ancient Egypt, Rawlinson, Volume 1, pages 346 and 347. Not only have we the stately hymns, we have also the prayers which were uttered to the sun. At the time of the plague of darkness, it was invoked as the substance of ages, the one who gave birth to himself. The circle of the great gods has adored thee, the circle of the lesser gods has worshipped thee in all thy beautiful forms. My heart is tranquil through all thy bread. Receiving thy food in the gate of the house of obelisks off the table of the gods of On. On is Heliopolis, the city of the sun. From a tablet in the British Museum. Period about the close of 18th dynasty. The adjoining illustration, with its eye teaching, is too suggestive to be omitted. The peculiar form of sun worship which it celebrates was not that in vogue at the time of the plague. However, life emanating from the sun was none the less a belief in that period. And there are monuments extant in Thebes analogous to this taken from Tel Amarna. The disk and the rays of the sun are portrayed, and at the ends of the rays are hands, and in some of these is the symbol of life, which is placed under the nostrils of the human being. In a tomb at Thebes, the rays of the sun are represented with hands, and with the sign of life communicating its influence to the human subject. Nile Gleanings, Villiers Stewart, page 82. Earth's earliest idolatry arose out of the exaltation of the glories and movements of the heavenly orbs, and to our own day the greater part of mankind gives these bodies homage, or offers them direct worship. Israel in its day fell into the sin of turning to the east, and forfeited in consequence the glory cloud of Jehovah's presence. Ezekiel chapter 8 verses 16 to 18, and Ezekiel chapter 10 verses 18 to 19. The plague of God sent darkness over the land, for 3 days and nights, blotted out the host of heaven from the sight of the worshippers, and put a stop upon the services of the temples, and we may assume that at the time of its occurrence some grand ceremony in honor of the celestial bodies was about to take place. At the bidding of Jehovah, and without a word of warning, Moses stretched forth his hand towards heaven, and at once a darkness that could be felt chained every Egyptian to his place. None moved, all were bound, as it were, in a prison of outer gloom. For 3 days and nights, though the sun shone on high, and the moon and the stars gave forth their light, no ray penetrated the shroud that was swathed about Egypt. The darkness was the prelude to the coming death. This sign of divine displeasure ended where the Egyptians dwelt. There the line of demarcation was drawn by God's omnipotent hand. The Hebrews had light in their dwellings. The divine intention in this must have been apparent to all. On the one hand there was darkness which was about to end in death, on the other there was light which was the prelude to life and liberty. God describes his people as the children of light, and those who are not, as of darkness. There was no shading off between the darkness and the light in the plague. And as it was, so it is, there is no twilight, and all are, therefore, shut up to the one or the other, to living in the light, or to living in the darkness. Divine judgments do not soften the human heart. Pharaoh called for Moses and said, Go ye, serve Jehovah. Only let your flocks and your herds be stayed. But upon these terms being rejected he was enraged. He dwelt in the darkness, and was as dark as it. Even in earthly things, evil men do not become converted to that which is good and lovely by a term of imprisonment. Pharaoh remained unchanged. He would not humble himself. He had developed impiety upon impiety, and, though he fain would have spared himself further suffering, he was determined in his resistance to the divine word, and only said to Moses, "Get thee from me, take heed to thyself. See my face no more, for in that day thou shayest my face thou shalt die." Exodus chapter 10 verse 28. It will be well at this point to notice the process of heart hardening which scripture applies to Pharaoh. There are 3 words used in the Hebrew, which are rendered harden in relation to the king. 7 times it is said, "He hardeneth his own heart," or, "His heart hardened itself," chapter 8 verse 13, where it should read, "Pharaoh's heart resisted," and verses 14 and 22, chapter 8 verses 15, 19, and 32. And chapter 9 verse 7. After this sevenfold obduracy, and not till then, is it said, "The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart." This is said 4 times, chapter 9 12, 34, and 35, and chapter 10 verse 1. And on the last occasion the hearts of Pharaoh's servants are included in the judgment. It has been pointed out in this chapter how Pharaoh's court intervened when the locusts were threatened. They would not, however, yield to Jehovah, they preferred the favor of Pharaoh. So that this hardening of their hearts on that occasion is very striking. A definite and willful obduracy is stamped upon Pharaoh's spirit, and a determined rejection of the divine warnings, becoming deeper and deeper with sevenfold intensity. After that climax, he and his court, which also rejected God, were delivered over to their doom. At the beginning of this chapter reference was made to the resemblance existing between the gods and kings of Egypt. If we accept Meneptah, the son of Ramesses the Great, as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the man whose hand and will rose up to contend with the Almighty Jehovah, any information that may assist us better to comprehend his character will be interesting. The key to the pride possessing him was his belief that he was the incarnation of the deity. The ruling pharaoh of the day was the living image and the vice-regent of the sun. He was the living representation of the deity, and was addressed in terms precisely similar to those wherewith they worshipped the god. An ode to him runs thus: "Thou art, as it were, the image of thy father, the sun, who rises in heaven. Thy beams penetrate the cavern. No place is without thy goodness. Thy sayings are the law of every land. When thou reposest in thy palace, thou hearest the words of all the lands. Thou hast millions of ears. Bright is thy eye above the stars of heaven, able to gaze at the solar orb. If anything be spoken by the mouth in the cavern, it ascends into thy ears. Whatsoever is done in secret thy eye seeth it, O Benra Merriman, merciful Lord, creator of breath." The king Meneptah, son of Ramesses II, and his immediate successor. The translator adds that these words must not be regarded as merely courtly sentiment and flattery. People believed in the king's divinity.